Welcome to TrineDay's Roundtable 32, Land Value Taxation and the Deficit Myth from an Earth Rights Perspective. I am Bruce DeTorres, moderating. Today we will hear from publisher Chris Milligan, then Ed Dodson of the Henry George School of Social Science and the School of Cooperative Individualism, who will discuss the book The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy by Stephanie Kelton. And then Alanna Hartzok, who is an Earth rights activist and author of The Earth Belongs to Everyone. And Alanna will summarize the UN Human Settlements Program. And then we will have questions and answers with everyone. And now, our host, Chris Milligan.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you all for spending some time here on this roundtable where, we're looking to discuss different things and hopefully some point in time get a better world down here. Now, I've been around a while, and for many years I was a paper boy, and one thing when you're a paper boy, you get to read the news, but you also get to go and knock on people's door and ask them for money, okay? And collecting, and so when I first started, we would get Mercury head dimes, Buffalo head nickels, and all them type of things. And what got me thinking about this was I was thinking about John F. Kennedy and Benjamin Franklin. Okay. And so they, very interestingly, Ben Franklin was on the 50-cent piece when I was a kid. And then Kennedy got shot. 1964, we had Kennedy on the 50-cent piece. And, that was the last year. It was all silver, too. And so we're going to be talking about money and different things today. One thing I want to, first, I'm going to read a couple things here. And the first thing is a letter from Robert Morris, who we had his relative on a couple of roundtables back. He was basically the guy who financed the revolution and had the business sense to so that it worked. He worked a lot with Franklin. And here's a letter that was written from Franklin to Robert Morris about money and about public money. And, it's a little bit, 18th century English, but I'm going to read it here. The remissiveness of our people in paying taxes is highly blamable. The unwillingness to pay them is still more so. I see in some resolutions of town meetings an unwillingness about giving Congress a power to take it, as they call it, the people's money out of their pockets, though only to pay the interest and principal of debts duly contracted. They seem to mistake the point. Money justly due from the people is their creditors' money, and no longer the money of the people, who, if they withhold it and should be compelled to pay by some law, all property indeed, except the savage's temporary cabin, his bow, his match coat, and his other little acquisitions, absolutely necessary for his subsistence, seem to me to be the creature of public convention. Hence, the public has the right of regulation and all other conveyances of property, and even the limiting the quantity and uses of it. All the property that is necessary to a man for the conservation of the individual and the propagation of the species is his natural right, which none can justly deprive him of. But all property superfluous to such purposes is the property of the public, who by their laws have created it, and who may therefore by other laws dispose of it, whenever the welfare of the public shall demand such disposition. He that does not like civil society on these terms, let him retire and live among the savages. He can have no right to the benefits of society who will not pay his club toward the support of it. And now I'm going to read some remarks by Senator John F. Kennedy at another Franklin, at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Memorial Dinner in Los Angeles, California, in March 1st, 1958, while he was still a senator. I was in New York to see the opening of a play about Franklin Roosevelt called Sunrise at Campobello. It is not a play about politics. It's not about the presidency or the Democratic Party. It's a play about the triumph of one man and his family over disaster, the disaster of physical illness. But I thought as I left the theater very deeply moved that this play portrays more than the stirring personal triumph. It has also brought to mind all the great qualities of leadership in the times of crisis for which FDR was famous. Whether or not one always agreed with his views and decisions, there was never any doubt about the vigor of his actions in the face of crisis. Not only the personal crisis of his paralysis, but the crisis of a country in economic chaos, the crisis of a world at war, and all the rest. We urgently need those leadership qualities in Washington today, for this nation now enters a period of crisis of greater proportions than we have ever endured. We are confronted with a deepening crisis in world affairs and in our relations with our allies and in our prestige with uncommitted nations. We must raise this nation's standard of living instead of the cost of living for the aged and the handicapped, for the migrant farm worker, for the unorganized and the underpaid and the underprivileged. We must give them their full and equal opportunity, regardless of race, color, creed, or national origin. And above all, in the words of Justice Holmes, whether we sail with the wind or against the wind, let us sail and not drift or lie at anchor. So long as there is one child without milk, so long as there is one family without a decent home, so long as there are aged people without pensions, working mothers without fair wages, struggling farmers without income, so long as there are overcrowded schools, inadequate hospitals, and families on relief, so long we will need for the Democratic Party to continue. So long we be called upon to assume the responsibilities of leadership. We can wage unrelenting war against drought and poverty and illiteracy and illness and economic insecurity. We can build through strength and justice and realistic leadership a lasting peace. And we can go forward to a new and better America, never satisfied with things as they are, daring always to try the new, daring nobly and doing greatly. He was a great man. John F. Kennedy was.
Thank you, Chris. And now, Ed, you put a lot of work into the PowerPoint we're about to see. How are you today?
I'm doing just fine, Bruce. Before I begin, I want to say one thing in response to Chris, listening to him repeat what John F. Kennedy said. It reminded me, believe it or not, of the chairman of the Federal Reserve System during Roosevelt's administration, Mariner Eccles. So if you think there are a few financiers or people in the money system without a conscience or a heart, get a hold of Mariner Eccles' biography, or his autobiography, actually. But he was quite the individual as well. And I think that's why Roosevelt chose him. So we're gathered to talk a little bit about modern monetary theory and the Georgist response to what modern monetary theory offers. There have always been critics of how money is created. I've studied this subject pretty thoroughly, and you can go back to Aristotle and you can find, ancient critics about how money is created and how it comes to be utilized and monopolized, etc. Well, there's been a group of economics professors and some outside the discipline who have in recent years emerged with arguments that began in the late 19th century regarding the role of money. And this short presentation will explain that policies based on modern monetary theory actually ignore the systemic importance of economic rent And the analysis first developed by this fellow, political economist David Ricardo, who formulated something he called the law of rent. Well, Ricardo's insights were verified in the late 19th century by none other than Henry George. And he then applied Ricardo's insights to land of all types and to nature generally. Ignoring the issues relating to land, its ownership, and the distribution of economic rents, Professor Stephanie Kelton has challenged her mainstream colleagues with the argument that money is actually a creature of law rather than a simple medium of exchange determined by market forces. And she has generated considerable debate over the question of whether deficits actually matter. The starting point is that our monetary system today has no direct relationship as it once had to a nation's storehouse of gold and silver. The so-called gold standard is no more. Governments today all utilize a fiat currency, meaning that the currency is not a receipt evidencing an ownership claim on any particular tangible asset. Because ours is a fiat currency, it can be expanded essentially without limit as needed. I often describe the Federal Reserve notes that we have in our wallets as promises to pay nothing in particular, because what a dollar will purchase today will change. Maybe later today or tomorrow, it could increase in its exchange value or lose exchange value. And that is why it's a fiat currency. There's nothing particularly tied to it. In her book, The Deficit Myth, Professor Kelton challenges what she describes as serious myths regarding government's powers to create money and to impose taxation on us. Here's what she writes. Taxes are critically important, but there's no reason to assume the government must raise taxes whenever it wants to invest in our economy. In practice, the federal government almost never collects enough taxes to offset all of its spending. Deficit spending is the norm, and everyone in Washington, D.C. knows it. Well, Henry George, quite differently, argued that the aggregate rent of land, by which he means all of nature, is the natural and just public share of the tangible wealth that we produce. Capture rent to pay for needed and desired public goods and services, and this would be more than sufficient to meet the needs of any society without the necessity to confiscate earned income or private wealth by taxation. Well, that at least was George's argument as the 19th century was coming to an end in a much simpler time where government played a much smaller role in our daily lives. Well, what about today? There's a study that was performed in 2015 by William Larson at the U.S. Department of Commerce that estimated the value of all the land in the United States at $23 trillion. Seems like a lot. Remembering that our deficit, our public debt now is considerably higher than that $23 trillion. But there's an even more difficult challenge of trying to determine the potential annual rental value of all urban, rural, and resource-laden tracts of land, as well as other natural assets. Natural assets include such things as the frequencies on the broadcast spectrum, paths for satellites around the planet, or even takeoff and landing slots at airports. The last one is extremely important because no two airplanes can occupy the same place at the same time without disastrous results. So what these diverse assets all have in common is that their supply is finite, or in the language of economics, the supply is inelastic. You can't make any more. Nature provides all that there is. So, acknowledging the idea that what I'm going to talk about next is a rough estimate, I just ask you to follow along. The price of any income-producing asset is logically determined by capitalization of its income stream. Thus, if I own a parcel of land that I can lease to someone for $12,000 a year, and the generally obtained annual market rate of return is 5%, my parcel of land should sell for 20 times its rental value, or around $240,000. It's likely to actually sell for more than that because the owner might be asking a price not based on today's value, but the price that he estimates it's going to be worth in 5 or 10 years. So speculation comes into play with regard to the pricing of such assets that have an inelastic supply. So using the same analysis for all the land in the United States and accepting the estimate by Mr. Larson of $23 trillion, the potential annual rental of the value of the entire nation comes to roughly $1.15 trillion annually. So based on the federal spending of $6.5 trillion this year, a high level of taxation would still be necessary if balancing the budget is ever to be an objective. But I want us to look a little bit deeper. In a paper presented in 2012 at an economics conference, economics professor Fred Foldvari, in a paper he wrote titled "Why Rent Matters, the Hidden and Suppressed Economic Rent," tried to answer the question. His conclusion is that the $23 trillion figure is far lower than the actual number. Based on studies he had access to, he says, several studies of the amount of land rent in the U.S. economy have estimated that the rent is about 20% of national income. What would that produce? Well, the GDP, the gross domestic product of the United States this year, is projected to be 29 trillion. If Foldvari statistic is accurate, this means there's $5.8 trillion in rent to be publicly captured. And that's an amount that's almost, but not quite sufficient to balance the federal budget. So maybe if the federal government, trimmed a little here and there, if captured rent from all sources, we would have, in fact, a balanced budget. And then I'll give you a little bit of statistics where some of this money might come from. Here's a chart on the total revenue from federal oil and gas and mineral leases up through 2021. In 2019, the federal government received $4.9 billion in revenue from oil and natural gas leases and other leasable minerals and geothermal resources just on onshore federal lands. So it doesn't include, the seas and subsurface minerals at the bottom of the oceans. In 2022, thankfully, the Congress finally got into its head that this was not right. They took the remarkable step of reforming the leasing system, and based on the new formulas for charging royalties or rents, this should generate some multiple of the $4.9 billion going forward. Here's the basic principle that's involved in terms of justice that Henry George would argue for, that I argue for, and many of our colleagues argue for. The basic principle ought to be that any public land offered under lease to private individuals or entities be awarded by competitive bidding for a leasehold interest, not to purchase it to get a deed, but for a leasehold interest. The rent payments adjusted periodically based on changes in the market, so that market determines what rental values are, and the government collects them to pay for publicly decided upon public goods and services. So, given the current circumstances, what would happen if the government simply directed the Fed to issue whatever money is needed for essential public goods and services, such as healthcare, education, infrastructure, affordable housing, addressing the climate change problems, and broadening equality of opportunity, or even a jobs guarantee program as recommended by Stephanie Kelton, and probably John F. Kennedy and Mariner Eccles would both, solidly support? It's a bit complex. One of the most important arguments made in favor of policies based on MMT is that the use of a sovereign currency eliminates the very idea of a budget deficit. Borrowing by government, that is the issuance of bonds, becomes therefore a strategy to take excess liquidity out of the private sector when the risk of inflation is evident. And that's a big part of the problem with MMT. How do we define inflation? Well, the primary reason for taxation under MMT is not to raise revenue then, but to achieve other social and political objectives, such as directing investment activity. We used to have investment tax credits. Perhaps they need to come back. Investment tax credits meant you get a tax credit if you build a new plant, if you install new equipment, if you employ people in producing goods. We don't have that any longer under our federal government's tax policy. But as important, I suggest, is the objective not addressed by Professor Kelton, which is to publicly capture income flows that are unearned. And rent is unearned to individuals and to private entities. Rent that becomes privatized is gained by rent-seeking privileges under law and by speculation. Stephanie Kelton and others in the MMT camp generally simply acknowledge that taxes are good for altering the distribution of wealth and income, but they don't distinguish between what is unearned income and what is earned income. To turn to that, I'm going to quote from Professor Michael Hudson, one heterodox economist who has a strong understanding of the link between the land and money questions. And he warns that there's a fundamental flaw in many of the MMT theorist writings. And here are 3 slides to come with Michael's quotes. He starts out by saying, much superficial confusion between the FIRE sector, FIRE meaning finance, insurance, and real estate. Much superficial confusion between the FIRE sector and the production and consumption economy comes from repeating the oversimplification of the classical monetary formula, MV equals PT. And if you're not an economist, you probably are not sure what that means. It's shorthand to argue that the money supply, M, multiplied by the velocity of circulation, V, is equal to the number of transactions involving money payments, T, times the average price of each transaction, P. So good luck with that. And if anyone's taking Econ 101 these days. He goes on, he says, I should have moved on so you could read that. Okay, second slide. The problem is that this analysis used by many MMTers does not distinguish between government spending into the FIRE sector and asset markets as compared to spending into the real economy on employment and production, including the building of public infrastructure, for instance. Okay, and the last slide from Michael. Without this distinction, it is not possible to see whether deficit spending is productive by aiming at supporting employment and output, or merely aims at supporting asset prices and making sure creditors do not lose the value of their financial claims on debtors, claims that have become unpayable and thus are a bottomless pit of government deficit spending in the end. Michael's talking about the bailout. When things go really wrong and all this system crashes, well, everyone who has benefited up to that point by rent seeking and by speculation is looking for a government bailout, a bailout from either the taxpayers or the creation of new money by the Federal Reserve System. Professor Kelton has not, that I can find, written anything suggesting she understands the systemic benefits of the public capture of rents rather than the taxation of earned income or the tangible assets we produce or our commerce. Maybe someone else out there can find an article where she deals with this in a paper or a conference, presented at a conference, but I haven't been able to find anything on it yet. She sees monetary policy simply as part of the government's tools for meeting the physical and social needs of the nation. And that's not a bad objective. She writes, what matters is not the size of the debt or who holds it, but whether we can look back with pride knowing that our stockpile of treasuries exists because of the many, mostly positive interventions that were taken on behalf of our democracy. And certainly the spending, what we spend on requires a lot of, judgment on the part of people as to what they think government should be spending on. So getting back to Henry George, what would he have to say about all this? I have a couple quotes from an 1896 article he wrote titled "Beneath the Silver Question." Back in 1896, this was a big political economic issue. And that was, should we monetize the currency using silver as a backing or just gold? The whole issue of bimetallism was a major presidential campaign issue when William Jennings Bryan ran for president a couple times. George writes based on his understanding of greenbackism. And here's what he said. Greenbacks were issued during the Civil War because simply the Union did not have sufficient gold in its reserves to maintain a gold-backed currency. So greenbackism was something that was tried, and it proved to be relatively effective at controlling inflation. So that's the context in which George is writing. Greenbackism, so called from the popular name of the direct issue of paper money made by the national government during the Civil War, was in original and rational form the recognition of the fact that this money needed no backing of deposited bonds or gold reserves, and was the cheapest and fairest form of money, giving to the greater part of the country what it had never had before, a uniform and convenient medium of exchange, and utilizing for the benefit of the whole people the enormous economies affected by the substitution of paper for the precious metals. Before I go to the next slide from him, if you look up greenbacks and you look at the details, there was an implied promise by Abraham Lincoln and his administration that sometime in the future, when things got more stable, that greenbacks could be presented to the Treasury for exchange for gold or silver certificates, which would then be redeemable in gold or silver. So in part, the success was this implied promise. You can look up in the history books whether that implied promise was ever lived up to. All right. So George goes on to say, to control the money of a country is to it the infallible means by which the few can take to themselves the earnings of the many, to secure the issuance of abundance of cheap money, the only way in which wealth may be made plentiful and its distribution fairly equalized, interest, or as they call it, usury, abolished, the dominance of the money kings destroyed, and the laboring masses emancipated. That is the power of controlling money that George recognized, and why he argued in his writings that government should have the sole authority to issue money. Yes. And finally, he says this: without stopping to question the validity or feasibility of the various reforms which the different schools of money reformers propose, what could any of them accomplish to change the conditions that are making the West and South the chronic and increasing debtors of the Northeast? They are on the wrong trail when they think to cure it by any adjustment of the money question. They must turn to something more than money. They must turn to that which is to man the whole physical universe, so far as it can use it to land. And with that, that's my commentary on modern monetary theory as interpreted from a Georgist perspective.
Thank you. I want to get right to Alanna and what you want to share, Alanna, about the UN Human Settlements Project, and also give you free rein, Alanna, to reflect and interrogate Ed to break down what we just saw for we lay people. Alanna Hartzok, author and Earth rights activist.
Thank you. Thank you. So kind of double duty here, right? I just, Ed, so with MMT, and they want to get the money by issuing bonds. So if a city is going to raise money through bonds, and then they
Well, wait,
build.
well, it's more complex because there's no one voice that interprets modern monetary theory. There are a range of voices, and some of those voices want to turn over currency issuance directly to the U.S. Treasury or to the Treasury of every government, eliminate the central bank with regard to that responsibility. There are others who say, okay, we continue to have the Fed, and the Fed can print its fiat currency, but we simply can then ask the Fed to destroy all the debt. It's paper. It's on a computer. All you need is to enter, press a couple keys, and the $34 trillion of debt, if the Fed holds it, is gone. The Fed can also then offer to take out the debt that's held in private hands. Issue money that gives to you, Alanna, because you hold a treasury security. You get the money to spend in the economy. The Fed gets the security back, and they can simply destroy it. Debt gone.
So in a country where it's estimated that maybe 5% or so of the private land is actually owned by about 85% of the private land is owned by only about 5% of the people. With just MMT, without addressing the land problem, you're still going to have the land rent and land profiteering from those few who actually own disproportionate shares of the land and resources, correct?
Sure. Look, we know the answer. Henry George solved this problem theoretically. If you don't publicly collect the rent and it's privatized, it will be used as a basis for capitalizing the rent as an income stream into a selling price for land and other natural assets. So without dealing with that, you're going to have land speculation and inflation, and it's modern monetary theory does not solve that problem. And Michael Hudson explained why as well.
So it doesn't solve the gross wealth inequality problem or a lot of problems. So my experience with people in this discussion around the money problem or the land problem, there are some who say maybe they a little bit understand the land problem, but they say the money problem is the most important one. And then others of us will say the land problem is absolutely crucial. And then there's those that don't understand the other side at all. But so many monetary people don't understand the land problem solution at all, as you just explained, the importance of understanding it in addressing wealth inequality and a lot of other social problems. So I myself, and having looked at the money issue, I know it's important. And from ancient times, there's always been prescription against prohibition on usury, that the money should not be used as a sort of source of profiteering or speculation. It should be simply a medium of exchange, more sophisticated than barter was. So that would be my view. I personally like the Public Banking Institute and what they're doing and how they're working in cities to establish public banks, and also on the state level based on actual it's South Dakota, I think it is, that has the public bank, or is it North? I sometimes forget which, if it's North or South Dakota. But I think that goes very, very well with the land value tax, and would like to see these two movements, which are both vibrant but both need a boost, working together. It could be very effective, very major movement. So I'll go on now, and I guess others that have questions to add, that they can be addressed later, but I'm going to take my 10 minutes or so and talk about a very exciting and extensive program that is going to be once again available to all of you and everyone, that I developed under a contract with the United Nations Habitat's Global Land Tool Network. And it's several components of this project, several documents. I'm going to give you the outline of all of these. What happened was I did this contract in a period of about 1.5 years up to 2 years. My director was very pleased with the work. I had brought in about 23 expert Henry George land value tax people from about 12 countries for various aspects of this. It was very refined in its editing. So a lot of work. It's the biggest project I have ever done. And my director within the Habitat Agency was quite pleased with the work when it was completed. However, he then had to give it up to the next level. And this was going to be rolled out with very well-designed, as the United Nations does, graphics materials and online and paper copies, and major then impetus for implementation of land value tax. When he sent the whole project up that I had completed to the next level, suddenly I receive an email that says, well, thank you very much. We appreciate the work you've done. We're not going to use any of it. We're going to look elsewhere for other approaches. So that was pretty devastating. Certainly pulled the rug out from under me. And I have to ask what happened. And I can only suspect that what happened could have been that the UN, as most of us may be aware, is a positive and a negative. The positive is the wonderful way that people from all around the world, both government officials, delegates to the UN, and non-governmental organizations by the thousands, come together in deep discussion and consideration and prepare documents by consensus for very positive ways forward to the United Nations. Yes, it was North Dakota. That's the bank of the I was talking about. Thanks for that. So, but it also, as we know, we all know that we're up against really big money powers, those who have massive amounts of control of money and land and resources. And that is also at play at the United Nations. So that even the good things that move forward, like I think the very excellent sustainable development goals for Agenda 2030, you will hear those being maligned. And there is reason to be very cautious, because it's in the implementation and it's in the financing that's the problem. And where we're at now is a global institution like the UN is preparing to really very strongly get the world to implement a global income tax. Whereas we would say taxes should come local to global from the resource rent of surface land, minerals, water, all the gifts of nature, according to the domain local to global, is where we should pay for our public needs. So it's a real big struggle in the UN, and no doubt my work got caught up in this through input from IMF, World Bank types. And that's the nefarious forces in the UN, even though there may be people that think they're doing good work with them. They're really using the money and monetary policy to control the world. So with that said, I'm going to go through the components of this online course. There was at one point, because they said I could keep my work, fortunately. Usually when you're under contract, they take your work and put it on a shelf if they don't want to use it, but at least they graciously said I could use it. So we put it on Time Earth Rights Institute's website, and just kind of internet word of mouth, it built to about 900 people registered from about 60 countries. And it was rolling along quite magnificently. And then at some point, the website crashed. In those days, it wasn't so easy to recover information from the website, and down it went. But we're putting it all back up. And here's what we're putting up on the IU.org website, the International Union for Land Value Tax, a one-page short brochure. You'll be able to get the essence of what we're talking about, the land problem and land value tax, in one page. The long brochure is a few pages, but goes deeper, but still very succinct. Then we have an analysis, which called a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Okay. And we analyzed about, 18 countries and major cities who had implemented some form of the land value tax, land value capture to some degree. And we again looked at these in terms of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities. Some like to turn that T, the threat, into challenges. And then we did an overall strength, weaknesses, opportunity, and challenges of the land value tax, land value policy itself. All that is going to be up. I want to mention one of these is kind of interesting in particular. It's Tsingtao, China. And what happened was German land reformers who were Henry George people, somehow I'm not going to go into how this happened, but they got control of a significant territory in China. They brought in land value tax. This territory developed in a very, very positive way in a very significant manner. Sun Yat-sen, who was then to be called the father of modern China back in the early 1900s, he had heard about Tsingtao, of course, and then he heard the story of the German land reformers, and then he heard about Henry George. So he had said that we will base our 3 principles of the people largely on Henry George. Isn't that interesting? But then we saw Mao Zedong come in, we saw the communists come in, and as has happened previously, when the Henry George, which is I call perennial wisdom teachings, comes forward, there's a capture or a revolution that takes it away and shifts it either to the right or the left. So we got Mao Zedong. Michael Hudson is in Ed's slides. He's a very knowledgeable economist. There's some problematic things about Richard I certainly won't go into here, but he has told me, because I have known him personally for many years, he said, don't ever mention Sun Yat-sen because the Chinese have a very negative impression of him. Well, sorry, but Sun Yat-sen is the guy who wanted to bring Henry George to China. Why would Michael not want people to know that? But it is interesting to think that this was repressed by communist China, this very elegant approach. So anyhow, there's examples from all over the world well analyzed in this resource compendium. So then there is the most substantial part is an online course. And you're going to really understand the law of rent, which is the most important bit of this all. It will bring you an economic enlightenment. So it is not taught. See, this approach by the powers that should not be was ousted from academic economics some time ago. And we have here, I think we still have Chris Feder on the group here. And Chris, along with Fred Harrison and the aforementioned Fred Foldry, wrote the classic book on the corruption of economics, the whole story of how land, the earth itself, was taken out of the study of economics from classical economics through Henry George. And the factor of land, which refers to all the gifts of nature, the whole earth, was simply made into a subset of capital. And the economic paradigm we're under is simply labor and capital. And so they're not able to get a handle on wealth inequality and how you move out of this, what's become very vicious right-left dilemma of labor versus capital, monopoly capital versus everybody else, if you ask me at this point. But the story is very clear, and that's what happened. But this course is going to teach you the authentic economics. So you're going to have the first module looks at land rights and poverty. The second one is the depth of the law of rent and why it leads to how we have wealth inequality, the root cause of wealth and power inequality. Then we have module 3 that looks at this policy in terms of environment, development, climate issues, all sort of other social problems. It takes a look at how this policy will positively affect all these different social problems. Then we have module 4, which is the economics of war and peace. Very important that, 50% or more of our tax dollar goes to the military industrial complex for wars and past wars and so on. So it's very important that we get a handle, which those in the peace movement have not yet gotten this handle on the deep economics of war and peace. So that's module 4. Now, module 5 is the longest of the 5. It's implementation. So that's a rundown of how to implement the policy. Now, the International Union for Land Value Taxation has a small grants program for people who want to develop an implementation program where they live for land value tax. So once you take this course, you get this rundown on implementation, you'd be qualified to apply for small grant. There's a couple more aspects to this. One is over 300 quotes and statements from economists that understand the land problem, philosophers, statesmen. It's on the land ethic generally. It's on land value tax in particular, from ancient times, philosophy, scriptural, religious, and notable voices favorable, talking about the importance of Henry George. So that quotes and statements section. Then lastly, we had developed by the Center for Study of Economics, Joshua Vincent, who's been on the roundtable previously with us. It's a land value capture or tax. It's a calculator and description that cities can use to enter their data. You can elaborate different land value solutions and see the results in this calculator. So that, okay, with this course, yes, it's going to be offered. You see, it crashed. Let me tell you, the website crashed. A lot of the great research that the students had done was lost. But the material that I just described is all in the process of being posted again at viu.org. We'll try to notify everybody one way or the other when it's available. It should be available within a month or so. Then you can register and start in. It's going to be free, but of course, donation is going to be very welcome. THE, there you go, from Bruce in the chat, viu.org. All right. So that ends my part, but maybe in future we may have some of the roundtables that go into depth in some parts of this course. So thank you for
Absolutely.
all of you who are here.
I think I'd like to give Ed Dodson the opportunity to reply to you, Alanna, and then I'll go through the handful of comments in the chat, and I'll get to Marilyn, whose yellow hand is up. Make your questions known, folks, by typing them in the chat or raising your yellow hand icon. Ed, your thoughts?
I have one comment. Alanna Hartzok is the hardest working person I've ever known for trying to create economic justice in this world, and she deserves a lot of credit.
I would say that's you, Ed. Thank you, Ed.
I love brevity as the soul of wit. I'll hit the chat comments. Ed, what about the CHIPS Act? I think investment tax. This was from Marty Levin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your thoughts?
I mean, it's in the right direction, but it's still not systemic. I mean, we are faced with, without solving the systemic problems, all we can do is continue to put Band-Aids on the problems.
All right. Richard DeMare wrote, Henry Simmons had an elegant solution in 1933, fully integrate the Fed into Treasury Department and convert the existing Federal Reserve Bank credit note into a greenback, parentheses, a Federal Reserve promissory note. Ed, your thoughts?
Again, I'm not sure that it solves the problem. Again, I mean, what are you going to do? You either have a fiat currency or you have a currency that's redeemable in something tangible that's specific. I'm kind of a halfway guy in terms of the reform. I would like to see all of the gold bars that are held by governments and central banks turned into gold coinage that had the same weight and content in every country, and that coinage could then be used to help settle accounts between governments. It's not enough to fund all of the economic activity that goes on in the world, but at least establishes some kind of redeemable value based on gold content in a coinage. You could do it with silver as well, but all to be debated.
Richard DeMare, your thoughts?
Yeah, and when Simons proposed that, there was silver coin because we went off the gold standard, but he was proposing silver coins at the time. And then I think Chris said that the silver went away in the mid 60s. So the promissory note today, if the Federal Reserve note was converted today, it would be redeemable for current coin, which is just tokens, which is what Henry George called for.
Yeah. Yeah. And the problem with gold or silver right now is that you create a solid gold coin, then how are you going to use that in ordinary transactions or not?
Yeah, gold and silver should not be used, and George was clear on that. But he did say that he never called for the abolishment of coin. He said they should be tokens or counters, like in a poker game.
Well, there's also, James Buchanan's proposal to use construction bricks to back the currency.
Yeah.
And Nick Tiedemann presented that idea to the Russians. They didn't know what he was talking about. I did.
What does that mean? What does that mean? What does that even mean?
Well, it means, okay, if you want to back money with something tangible, why not construction bricks? Construction bricks have all of the positive qualities of gold and silver and none of the negatives. You don't have to store them in vaults guarded by, elaborate security systems. You can produce them very easily at the same level of quality all around the world, and they have a constant demand. Now, the criticism that I've gotten with this, with Buchanan's idea, is that people are using fewer bricks these days than they did in the past. We see a lot more buildings, coated with stucco than bricks. But it's part of the discussion, and it's
Wow.
See,
I would say
crazy. This is crazy stuff, isn't it?
No,
He was
because
a
I could.
economist, James Buchanan, right? Wasn't he a Nobel-winning economist?
Yes.
So I think it's a crazy idea myself, but
Are you talking about the president before Lincoln?
No.
No. He's an economist.
different one.
I love connecting dots.
Born in
I'm gonna-
Franklin County, where I live, you're talking about.
Wow. All right, Marilyn, and then Wendell, and then I want to pop in with a question before anybody else. Marilyn, how are you?
Hi, thank you. Sorry I got on the discussion a little late, but I appreciate Edward Dodson's presentation, and Alanna, always like your talks. I have to ask you to pardon my ignorance. I'm trying to learn and to really grasp the whole land value tax concept, and Alanna has taught me a lot about it. But one concept I still don't fully understand is what is meant by land rent. And let me give you a couple of examples of large tracts of land that's privately owned, and the owner of the land is actually using it, has put good, developable things on it, is using it productively. One example, the city I live in has a very large tract of land owned by the Chevron Corporation, and they have a refinery there that produces aviation fuel, useful for a lot of people. Let's say another tract of land out in the Central Valley of California near me, 100 acres that has been developed into productive farmland. The owner of that land, whether it's one family or a company, is producing agriculture products on it. Now, neither of these tracts of land are being rented. So how would the concept land rent apply to either of those examples?
You want me to take that, Alanna, or do you want to go?
You can take it and then I'll add on if I have anything.
Those parcels of land have an imputed rent. It may not be collected, but it's there to be collected if the public sector decides to, or even the private owners decide that they would rather lease the land to a third party than to utilize it themselves. So every parcel of land, every tract of land has some potential annual rental value that would be yielded if the land was offered for lease. And that value is unearned to the individuals. It's unearned to the owners. It is basically there either because nature has made one parcel of land much more richer in terms of its potential productivity than another, or the community has invested in infrastructure and amenities to make this site very attractive for people to come there to do their commerce or even live there, etc. So that's where rent comes from. It's the differential between locations based on either the natural or societally provided amenities.
Okay, so let me just ask about that. So you mean the value of the location of the land, not because let's say the refinery, it does have a value because it's located right on the San Francisco Bay where it has easy access to oil tankers. That is, the company had nothing to do with that. But but the company did build the refinery, and without a refinery, who would want to lease that land, you know? So when you determine the land rent, don't you have to take away the aspect that the landowner, the improvements that the landowner actually made, and just strip that away when you determine the land rent? Is that, am I getting that?
Absolutely. And then it's just the fair and accurate assessment of the land. And you're right to point out it's a lot of location value there with the shipping. So then what you do is you take a percentage of that value, and that would be your annual tax. You would be taking that percentage of that value. Well, just say it's something valued $100,000. And so 5%, and property tax now is like often 2% or less of the value. So there's, as this moves along in implementation, that percentage can vary, but you got to think in your mind like 5, and some even say maximum it would be 10% of the value is what you would pay in your tax as a land rent. But you're not to pay other taxes. That's where middle-class people, homeowners would pay less. We're taking the tax off of their house, their buildings, which right now the property tax is mostly on their house rather than the land value. We want to shift it off of the earned income. Mm-hmm. So that will mean you're shifting. It's a tax shift. This is never an additional tax if properly implemented. It's also, and you can do it revenue neutral, not even an increase in a tax bill, but it starts getting the incentives correct, anti-speculation, anti-land hoarding, pro-building affordable housing. So it's sometimes called an incentive tax. So is that clear enough? This is what you're really going to drill down in with this course. I said the one module is all about the land rent, Marilyn. So that course might help you, but is that helpful, this next step in understanding?
It is helpful. I think what's important for me is the concept that in determining the land rent, you take what the rent on the land would be without any of the improvements that the property owner has made. Just the location of it and any public infrastructure that was made available, and so that the landowner is not in some way penalized, because improvements that the landowner make could increase the value of the rent also. But that's not used to calculate the base rent.
The land rent is all about the location.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Wendell Fitzgerald, unmute, please.
The monetary question is fascinating and wonderful, but it seems the whole idea of taxing the unearned income from the value of land, and broadly defined, is a very large percentage of GNP, is it not? And that would be, is it 40%, 50%, whatever that figure is? It's a very large.
Fred Fold already said it was 20% in his estimate, but it might be considerably higher.
We don't know. So whatever it is, my guess is that it's actually higher than much higher than the current federal budget, most of which, our current tax system falls some on unearned incomes, some, on the income from renting land, but most of it falls on earned incomes from renting the building on land or activities of productive people. The idea is that if we would shift our taxes to an unearned income and off of earned incomes, it would produce wonderful downstream economic results. It would encourage building and all of that. We've seen that happen in Pittsburgh and other places in Pennsylvania that allows cities to do this. But the point ultimately would be we've got a $34 trillion debt, upon which we owe all this interest. My guess is that one of the things that we want to do with that very large amount of taxation of unearned incomes is use it to retire that debt. So if it was 40% of GNP, that would be a hell of a lot of, we could use right now, a very large percentage of our yearly budgets, federal, and state, local, go to pay the borrowing. My understanding is that there was no borrowing was ever needed because the community itself creates such value as indicated by the assets that are that produce an unearned income, like land, all natural resources, and a bunch of other sources of unearned income that we could pay. We could live with debt free because we could pay our current debts right now, this year, without going into debt. Number one.
In terms of the percentage, Brian Kavanaugh in Australia did some pretty meticulous research and came out with a nice graphic visual showing that that's like 25 up to 30% of GDP for Australia. And others who've looked at this in different countries, they keep coming up to this, that land rent is 25 to 30% of GDP. We know that GDP is a rough number anyhow, but I think all we're saying here is it's very significant. Economists who don't know what they're talking about, who are anti this, will say, oh, it's not enough to fund the government the way it is now. That's an old archaic idea. They just don't know what they're talking about because they don't have accurate information, and they may be trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. But it's significant.
But my question is, would it not be possible to run our public business at various levels of government, starting local, because it starts with the property tax, to fund all of our local government activity fully without going into debt?
Yeah,
when you're looking at goods and not ilth, when you're looking at creating wealth and not ilth, when you're not building weapons of mass destruction and all these things that are also not needed, or giving massive subsidies to corporations.
Well, those are the other aspects of other assets that give you an unearned income. So we tax it away. Let's tax it all.
Yeah.
Like tax the full rental value of land every year, starting at the local level, state, federal.
All of that would be wonderful if we ever got close to it. I mean, right now, Alanna and a team of people are trying to get Baltimore to consider even a revenue neutral shift in the property tax. And this is where MMT comes into play. MMT says we can immediately deal with the debt without exposing ourselves to hyperinflation. Is that doable? I don't know for sure, but you don't believe it is, Wendell. I think it's still up for argument, but certainly there's no reason, since Alan Greenspan and the rest of them embarked on increasing the amount of money that was issued by the Federal Reserve, that they could just cancel the securities that they hold. And again, go into the markets and buy the securities by producing new money and then cancel those securities. And the debt would essentially disappear. It would be great if we're also increasing the ability to capture rents publicly at the same time.
Yeah, that's what we need to do.
That's what we need to do. Thank you. I want to ask a quick question, and so I can get to all the questions in the chat and all the hands that are raised. It seems, I'm going to say honest economics, that consider the land problem, Alanna, is analogous to the earth is round, and the economics that have been screwing us, that have been put in to replace that, are the earth is flat. Is that a decent analogy?
Yes, in that we've been steered in a false direction.
Amen. Thank you. Touchdown. Next question. Ruth wrote, do you know about the intention to put a monetary value on every grain of sand on our earth? I think it is the WET, maybe you meant F, that's proposing this. I feel threatened by this, but no understanding why. Who wants to answer that?
No idea.
Alanna?
Well, there already is a value because humans put value, and they put monetary value on everything. It's who's getting that value. And sometimes people ask about indigenous people and land value tax. If indigenous people, whatever land they still have sovereignty over, they make it work however they want to make it work for them to fairly share their land.
Ruth, I want to ask you to clarify succinctly where your question came from in search of a very succinct answer.
I just heard it in certain discussions, and that this is something that is proposed to put a value on every animal, every drop of water, every tree, everything. I find that very, very threatening, and I just wanted to know, to see. I mean, I love what you're talking about, but this feels like a toxic level of that.
It is a toxic
Well,
level.
this
Yeah.
seems to me, coming from an environmentalist perspective, that if we have no monetary value on these animals and plants, we simply destroy them and don't take care of them. And so by attaching some sort of a monetary value and economic value on them, that perhaps we will be more respectful of their value. And
Yeah, that sounds like a cover to metering it, like all energy, you know, whatever energy could have been free. As soon as you can meter it, boy, you can profit by selling it. Did I cut you off too rudely, Ed?
no, it's one of these values issues, and economists and sociologists, they all want to put numbers to everything. So there is a value to the clean air. Okay, what number is it? Well, what does it cost us every year in terms of illness and disease and death to not have clean air? So
That'd be very interesting. But Ruth, I have your same trepidation because the people at the overlords who seem to be in charge of that kind of evaluation have a decent history of doing horrible harms to us. Ruth, you've got the last word on this before the next question.
You know, I just feel like, you know, the Georgist economics, this feels like it's on steroids and toxic. But it feels in some ways I just am looking at kind of trying to find an understanding of the difference in the consciousness of what this is about.
The Georgist economics sounds to you on steroids and toxic?
This thing that the World Economic Forum
Understood. Absolutely. I had to get that straightened out. Thank you.
The
Yeah.
exact opposite, but I think it's
All right.
interesting that at the same time Georgist economics is coming out as a solution, this other thing that feels like it's a kill shot is
Yeah,
going on
wow.
that has a similar, you know, monetization of what is the earth.
I feel the same way, but I'm glad Ed Dodson commented to the extent that it balanced my scales on it to not automatically descend into the doom and gloom that I can tip into. Joe Polito, your hand's been patiently raised there. What is your question, please?
Oh, okay.
I just want to point out to Ed that it was Charles O. Hardy that had the brick-backed money proposal. You may remember that from Ronnie Phillips in your conversation with him. And I think it's a wacky
so
idea.
you're saying that Buchanan stole it from him?
I guess. But it was originally Charles O. Hardy. Yeah.
Are you saying Charles O. Hardy is the forgotten American president nobody knows about?
He's an economist, and he did come up with the brick-backed money, which is pretty
Wow.
batty to me. It's just a very expensive, cumbersome fiat money.
Thank you. Our host, publisher, Chris Milligan.
Okay, well, you know, one thing that Ed talked about, and I was thinking about before here, is government money. Okay, because you know, we all live in different polities. Okay, I mean, there's different countries around the world. Okay, and we live together in little groupings, kind of, you know, say. And so, I mean, having a government issued money, okay, seems to me to be the proper way to go. Okay, rather than having a whole bunch of different banks each issuing their own money within a country. A little comment about Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen actually he got captured by some bankers and the drug networks. What he set up later on. Through Chiang Kai-shek, because he basically ran his government over through narcotics. Okay, is how he raised his money to run that. And then also, if you look at like in religion, okay, I mean, we've done several books about the Mother Goddess. Okay, they've also pulled her out of a lot of the things. And then I'd like to talk about. We have an author, Whitney Webb, a very erudite young lady. She's written a book called One Nation Under Blackmail. And then she has a website called Unlimited Hangout. And I strongly recommend people to go there. I'm going to put a couple of links into the chat. The first one is an article. It's about the chain of custody mafia. holding Bitcoin. Okay. And in it, what you find out is a lot of, especially a bunch of the people around the start of PayPal, okay, who are now very uber wealthy, okay, are capturing, okay, a lot of the Bitcoin, okay, and this is a thing from what's his name, Fink from BlackRock, okay, and because they're trying to tokenize everything. Okay, and he says, as noted by Fink in his statements on mass tokenization, there will eventually be one ledger where everyone and every asset has their own number. You know, and I mean that's what these guys are trying to work towards. Okay, and one of their buddies is now. Well, Mr. Vance, okay, who is the vice president that Mr. Trump has chose, is right into these people, and this thing about the you know who is holding the Bitcoin, because basically they're looking, okay, to capture, okay, our economies and our governments through the use of Bitcoin, and then the other thing they're looking to do is to tokenize. I mean, just everything. Take some little economic thing, and okay, we're going to make that into a security, and we're going to sell it. We're going to sell it, and it's all just it's a house of cards.
And in that selling, do they trade it? Is it for their financial speculation, like like the stock market, to just drive up its value take their profits?
Yeah, well, it's a stock market, and I mean, it gives them something to sell. Okay, because just taking these things, putting them together. Okay, we're going to sell it, and it, it's really it's a house of cards, and that's where they want to take us. Okay, so I mean, really, we need to understand what money is, what money does, what a country is, what a country does. Okay, and I really appreciate all the Ed's I thought was very good. Alanna's are very good, and the more that all we can understand this, and hopefully we'll still be able to do something in 6 months.
Well, you just put everything that preceded what you just said. You just put in context of a whole new universe, which is the Bitcoin world and universe. Ed, you first. Your response to this?
I don't know where it's headed. Bitcoin is controversial because it's creating something out of nothing and then profiting thereby. So I view cyber currencies generally as a Ponzi scheme. Perhaps there is a cyber currency system that would not use the huge amounts of electricity that are required from its startup. I think this is still something to be thought about seriously, and hopefully those who are in power to make decisions over this will eventually find some rational discussion around what limits should be imposed, what regulations should be imposed. If it's something that we're not going to stop, it has to be appropriately regulated. And I spent 40 some years in the financial sector, and I can tell you that my biggest concern is that we've gone down a long road of financial deregulation that's created nothing but chaos, that's stimulated speculative investment, and led to the 2008 crash. And it's about ready to lead to another crash, in my view, coming up in just 2026 or thereabouts.
Why 26? Why then?
The property markets go through an average boom to bust cycle that lasts about 18 and a half years. This is something that, Georgia's economists have documented pretty well. You can read the book by Philip Anderson, The Secret Life of Real Estate, that talks about all of this in very much detail. But the bottom line is none of the economic policy making that's occurred since the end of the Second World War, which was thought to create stable markets and be able to create low inflation and full employment, have worked. And it's Henry George's analysis that is missing from that and that study, that equation. And MMT, as I've said, is a Band-Aid trying to deal with the consequences of the failure to do the right things.
Thank you. I want to get Alanna's response, if any, to what Chris put on the table.
Chris, any way you look at it, money is a symbol system. It's not the stuff itself. We have a great capacity, humans, for abstractions and using our mind in an abstract way, but we have a body, it's physical, it needs food, shelter, water, it needs earth elements. So we got to always bring the monetary people and discussions down to the earth. I once gave a lecture, I had a bowl, I filled it full of dirt just to make that illustration. So we have to, this is a perennial wisdom teaching to solve a perennial problem that Henry George simply rediscovered for himself about how to have the correct relationship of truth in order to forward our evolution of consciousness on this planet, to have the correct person-planet relationship, the nexus of fairness and justice, of humanity to the earth itself. So one of my favorite phrases, the earth belongs to everyone, or the earth is the birthright of all people as a fundamental human right.
Amen.
Okay, that is what land value tax is about. It's not just a clever, functional, wonderful tax policy. It's a deep philosophical first principle of the earth is our birthright. We're all equal as human beings. We need the earth to survive. If we want to have fair economics and all these other social problems solved, we have to honor that first principle.
Right. And then whatever video games or things we want to do with AI is just bonus, but we can't empower it or let it absorb the power to control how we buy the things we need to eat and sleep comfortably.
Right.
Wow. We've got 7 minutes left. Richard DeMare, you threw a couple nice replies. You responded to Chris's question about property taxes. Take it away.
The Supreme Court recently ruled on the Moore case, Moore versus U.S. Property taxes, in short, don't fly at the federal level. There's something called the direct tax clauses in the Constitution. So a land value tax does not work. The traditional property tax at the local level, that kind of tax would not work at the federal level. Alanna mentioned a global income tax.
The property taxes as we know or use them now wouldn't work at the federal level, but the land value tax probably would or could.
The land value tax is a property tax. It's a property on land only.
Let me offer this. Nick Tiedemann, who's a professor of economics at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, he's dealt with this issue, and here's his argument. Most rent is generated at the local level. So we need a different kind of revenue sharing. The revenue sharing should go from the local level up to the higher levels of government based on the citizenry desire for the services that are offered by, let's say, the state government and the federal government. So, yeah, there are rents that the public domain controlled by the federal government would yield, by the state government would yield. But Nick's argument basically is that revenue sharing should come from local and go up.
And also another point, very important, 48% of the land of the United States is federal land. Ed brought that in about the mineral resources that are undertaxed when they're leased out to corporations. That is also a land rent domain where the federal government could draw rents from land that it already controls in our name. So I've also written papers that look at land rent domains, local to global, because there's surface land for cities, then you have land rent from other mineral and natural resources for regions or for states, nations, and then the law of the seas would have been had been implemented. It should be there. 50% of those mineral nodules in the beneath the oceans would go to global governance to monitor the global commons and to also serve for peacekeeping. The things that we have to do on an international or global level, you would use an international land rent domain, such as the seas, for the land rent. Okay, so it's a subsidiarity. It's a strong decentralization with the land value surface tax for cities, and then a subsidiary up to regional and up to local. You might want to get a hold of my paper on that, Richard, and I'd love to. I think it's important discussion to have sometime too.
The federal government owns 48% of U.S. land, I think you just said. What, if anything, is that a cork in the flow of good things? How obstructive or detrimental to good things is that fact?
It's good.
Well, we the people aren't paying, for the most part, any attention to this whatsoever. That we could be drawing a lot more of the public finance on the federal level from this massive amount of federal lands that is rich in resources, is both being leased to ranchers and corporations at below market. So we need to get those up to market. And then we have issues like the state of Nevada is 15%. The private land, it's 85% federal land. So most of these federal lands are west of the Mississippi, right, and they're massive. And, you could just, hey, lease them out for ecological villages and towns for people who need affordable housing. Landless people. I mean, it's such one reason to keep this locked up, this federal land, is that it keeps the usable land, the land values higher than they would be otherwise. You see, if there's land locked out from access, then the land that's accessible, that value is going to be higher. So it allows this game of collecting the land rent privately, and also housing costs keep going up because land values go up, and therefore the banks collect the mortgage payments and they get the interest from the mortgage payments. So that's another place to look how the land problem and the money problem go together, is with the housing issues and how the mortgage payments work for ever rising land and housing costs.
We're going to go around with our panelists for their final words. We are pretty exquisite with keeping time. It's our last, minute or two here. I'll just recommend everybody again to look at the previous roundtables to get more context about what you just heard here. Marty asks in the chat for the link for the YouTube channel, Valediction Vision. Marty, I don't have the time to get that link and drop it in the chat right now, but you could just go to YouTube and search those two words, Valediction Vision. One of the top results of the search results will be the channel Valediction Vision.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And final thoughts, Mr. Ed Dodson?
We've just touched the surface of the issues that need to be flushed out and discussed, and I'm looking for the opportunity to come back sometime.
Thank you. Alanna Hartzok.
Well, first, thank you for everyone's time and attention to this very important topic. We are envisioning massive movements going worldwide from these kinds of conversations. The course and all the material I mentioned will be posted soon at theiu.org. I just put it in chat. And in the resources section is a free PDF of my book, if you want to look at that resource domains article that I mentioned. And also, as people get up to speed on this, we are fundraising for our small grants program, and I want to acknowledge Lillian Calvache, who is now with us, who has a small grant. She is working very avidly and effectively as a leader for the country of Colombia for the land value tax there. So this is a very real process, folks. We want you to welcome your engagement, and thank you for being with us.
Ruth, to your question, are Paul and Liz all right? They're fine. A truck hit a pole or something near their house and took out their internet, so they couldn't log on their computer. They were on this call at the beginning on their phone. I don't see them now, but they're fine. They have electricity. They've got air conditioning. They just don't have internet. Yeah, right.
We were trying to call them. Thank you for telling me that.
You're very welcome. Our host, who has published over the last 20 years about 200 books that challenge official history, things we have a right to know, Chris Milligan.
Well, again, thank you all for spending your time with us here. I think this is very important. I learn stuff every time, and this is how change happens. Change happens by discussion and learning. And so again, I really appreciate everybody for spending the time here, and Lord have mercy, and onwards to a better future for our children.